では、浜野先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、時間になりましたので、始めたいと思います。今年、2回目ですけども、マゴネット先生に、ご講演いただいて、感謝です。この後からも、いらっしゃる方あると思いますけど、時間になりましたので、始めさせていただきたいと思います。もう今いるメンバーみんなよくマゴネット先生のことを分かってらっしゃるので、紹介をするということなんですけれども、マゴネット先生、1942年ロンドンでお生まれになって、お医者さんをなさっていて、25歳でレオベックカレッジに行かれ、そして1971年ラビに任職されて、ヘブライ大学とハイデルベルク大学で学び、博士号を得られたと。それから1974年から、レオベックカレッジで教鞭をお取りになり、1985年から2005年学長をお務めになられました。諸宗教との対話のことをあちこちでヨーロッパあるいはイスラエルで、開かれ、またもちろんヘブライ語聖書の、講義をずっとなさっていらっしゃる、改革派ユダヤ教の代表する学者でありまして、2014年に本学の名誉博士号も授与、していただいております。あれですね、ウクライナの戦争のことが続いておりますけれども、ヘブライ語聖書と、それから暴力、平和、そのようなことについて、マゴネット先生からいろいろ伺いたいなという希望をずっと持ってまして、そのことを今日触れていただけるととても楽しみにしてまいりました。どうぞ、マゴネット先生、よろしくお願いします。ドクター・マゴネット、please start.
皆さん、こんばんは。I would like to thank Hihara Sensei for his translation of my paper. It's always a pleasure working with him to get a correct translation of my very strange English. It's tanoshii desu. Speaking untruth to power, the political intrigue that saved King David's throne. We are about to consider a dramatic event in the life of King David, as recounted in the biblical book of Samuel. Given this context, it is conventional to read it as part of a religious morality tale. King David, after a highly successful rise to become king of the united Israelite nation, has succumbed to the temptations of power. He takes to his bed Bathsheba, the wife of a military leader called Uriah the Hittite. And when she becomes pregnant, in a desperate attempt to conceal what has happened, David arranges for the murder of Uriah on the battlefield. Subsequently, he marries Bathsheba. For this act of abusing the office for which he was chosen by God, David is warned that God will punish him through the bad behavior of his own family in the future. One of these consequences is the successful uprising against David by his son Absalom. David manages to flee from Jerusalem with a few loyal retainers. It is this episode and the way in which David succeeds in turning the tables on Absalom that we will consider. But before I go into more detail, it helps to recognize other dimensions to the biblical book of Samuel. Firstly, it is brilliantly written, with the pace and depth of a novel, and enough characterization of the main protagonists to open endless levels of speculation about their motivations and behavior. But the book can also be read as a study of the roles and challenges of political leadership. Israel is in the process of creating a hereditary monarchy and discovering, through painful and divisive events, the pitfalls, personal ambitions, and conflicts that may stand in the way. How are issues like succession to the throne to be resolved? Above all, and this is where David's personal tragedy is acted out, How does the king reconcile the public requirements of the role of king with the responsibilities, problems, and emotional demands of his private life? The chapter immediately following the Bathsheba story introduces Absalom and the beginning of David's tragic personal story. David has several wives, and 6 sons were born to him in Hebron, where he reigned for 7 years before acquiring the throne of the entire kingdom of Israel. The firstborn is Amnon, whose actions trigger the tragedy we will encounter. The second, called Kileab, hardly features. The third is Absalom, born to Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, presumably a politically arranged marriage. The fourth son, Adonijah, will take his own turn to seek to become king through a coup when David is dying, only to be defeated by supporters of Solomon. As David's firstborn son, Amnon is presumably being groomed to succeed his father as king. But the very first thing we learn about Amnon is his obsessive infatuation with Tamar, the sister of his younger brother Absalom by a different mother. Amnon plots to be alone with Tamar, but loses his self-control and rapes her. Immediately he feels hatred for her just as much as he had previously desired her, and he has her thrown out into the street. Her life ruined, she takes refuge with her brother Absalom. David is furious at the matter, but whether for personal reasons or reasons of state, does absolutely nothing to punish Amnon. Absalom takes care of his sister and nurses the hatred he feels for Amnon, avoiding any contact with him. But 2 years later, Absalom acts. He arranges a celebration at the time of sheep shearing and persuades David to allow Amnon to attend with all the rest of the king's sons. When Amnon is in his cups, Absalom's servants, at Absalom's direct orders, assassinate him. We have gained our first information about the character of Absalom, that he knows how to hate, has great self-control, is a long-term strategist, can be utterly ruthless, and makes others do his dirty work for him, perhaps to ensure a degree of deniability. To escape David's anger, Absalom flees to Talmai, king of Geshur, his mother's father, and there he remains for 3 years. At this point, another important actor enters the scene. Joab is David's powerful and ruthless military commander-in-chief. He is a loyal supporter of David and his agent in organizing the death of Uriah the Hittite on the battlefield. But Joab is also willing to put pressure on David when he thinks David's actions might weaken the monarchy. He sees that David would like to be reconciled with Absalom and uses an elaborate plot to get David to invite his son back to Jerusalem. Once arrived, David still refuses to see Absalom and keeps him confined to his own house for a further 2 years. At this point in the story, the Bible introduces a little bit of information that will have enormous consequences later. The narrative technique is similar to what we are familiar with in movies. When the camera shows a telephone, we know that at a crucial moment, it will ring. Now we are told of Absalom's star quality and one particular attribute. I quote, "No one in all Israel was so admired for his beauty as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, he was without blemish. When he cut his hair, he had to have it cut every year, for it grew too heavy for him. The hair of his head weighed 200 shekels by the royal weight." Spoiler alert, we are supposed to remember the glory of Absalom's hair. Thoroughly impatient at being exiled from David's presence, Absalom twice asks Joab to intercede once again with David. When Joab refuses even to see him, Absalom has his servants set fire to Joab's barley field, which understandably gets his attention. So Joab persuades David to invite Absalom to the palace. On arrival, Absalom bows to the ground before David, and the king kisses him. Father and son are reunited and seemingly reconciled. But evidently, David's treatment of Absalom is a festering wound that will have consequences. As a potential successor to the throne, Absalom begins his own political campaign. We have no precedent within the biblical record for such a potential competition amongst the sons of a king to gain the throne. So we have to credit Absalom or his advisors with inventing the first successful marketing strategy for the self-promotion of a political leader. How could he establish the public image of his suitability? First, he provided himself with a chariot, horses, and 50 runners, thus promoting his royal persona and acquiring brand recognition. But he also worked hard to establish his populist credentials. He marketed himself not just as a glamorous royal figure, but as someone approachable by anyone in need. At the same time, his technique served to undermine the authority of his father and public confidence in his reign. I quote again from 2 Samuel 15. Absalom used to rise early and stand by the road to the city gates, and whenever a man had a case that was to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" And when he answered, "Your servant is from one of the tribes in Israel," Absalom would say to him, "It is clear that your claim is right and just, but there is no one assigned to you by the king to hear it." And Absalom went on, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, and everyone with a legal dispute came before me, I would see that he got his rights." And if a man approached him to bow to him, Absalom would extend his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Absalom did this to every Israelite who came to see the king for judgment. As the Bible concludes, Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. There is no record in the book of Samuel that King David was concerned about Absalom's behavior, and maybe he did even see him as his rightful successor. After several years, Absalom decided that his time to act had arrived. He asked David's permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a vow he had made all those years before, but if God brought him back to Jerusalem from his exile in Geshur, he would go to worship God in Hebron. David seems not to have been concerned about the possible implications, even though Hebron was the city where David himself was initially crowned as king. Absalom sent messengers in secret to all the tribes of Israel, saying, "When you hear the sound of the shofar, announce that Absalom has become king." Accompanying Absalom to Hebron were 200 men of Jerusalem, who were presumably invited in good faith and unaware of what was about to happen. They probably included people who might otherwise remain loyal to David, but would be unable to do anything at the crucial moment. Or else they could be useful hostages if anything went wrong. At last, we are about to be introduced to the first of two significant men who are central figures in this episode, and whose contrasting advice to Absalom will determine the final outcome of the rebellion. From the town of Gilo, Absalom brings Achitophel the Gilonite. He held the title of Yoetz, advisor or counselor to King David. Judging by the authority given to him by Absalom in what follows, Ahitophel may well have played a role already in devising the conspiracy. Why would someone so close to David have chosen to turn on David and help Absalom? The Bible gives no direct answer. The only clue comes from a couple of incidental verses that suggest a possible family-connected reason. Amongst the list of David's military heroes is a man called Eliam, son of Ahitophel, the Gilonite. And when we are first introduced to Bathsheba, she is described as the daughter of Eliam. If that is the same Eliam who is the son of Ahitophel, then the shame brought on the family by David's affair with Bathsheba may lie behind Ahitophel's apparent sudden disloyalty. Whatever the reason, we will learn shortly about the enormous significance of Ahitophel's support for Absalom. Word of the rebellion quickly reaches David in Jerusalem, and the old warrior is swift to react, making a strategic withdrawal from the city. He is joined by all his courtiers and his entire household, leaving only 10 concubines behind to mind the palace. On his way out of the city on foot, he reviews his military resources. They include the Keratites and Pelatites, hired mercenaries who form the king's own royal guard. But in addition, in a very moving show of support, he is joined by the 600 men who were his companions during the years of his exile in the land of the Philistines, when he was on the run from King Saul. Their loyalty to David is very touching, though given the many years that have passed since that time, they must have appeared as an aged and raggle-taggle group. One can imagine how the scene would appear in a movie as they struggle into their old battle attire, kiss their families goodbye, and make their individual way to join the departing column. David's actions are a fascinating mixture of brilliant strategic practice and profound humility before his God in the face of this dramatic turn of events. Zadok the priest appears with the Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant to join the king in exile. Creating a home for the Ark in Jerusalem had been an essential part of David's desire to establish the city both as the capital of the nation and the place for God to be present at its heart. But he had been told in a prophecy that he was not to be the one to build the temple as he had wished. However, David seemed to have learnt from earlier bitter experience that the Ark of the Covenant was not to be instrumentalized for his own personal use. Whatever divine power its presence might have afforded him, and however much it would confirm to the people that he was still king, David would not accept it. He says to Zadok, in one of those remarkable spiritual confessions that remind us of the depth of David's own relationship with God, I quote, "Take the Ark of God back to the city. If I find favor with the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see it in its abode. And if he should say, I do not want you, I am ready to let him do with me as he pleases." End of quote. But in the very next breath, David, the military strategist and erstwhile guerrilla fighter, informs Zadok the priest of where he plans to go, then arranges for the sons of the priests, Zadok and Abiathar, to become spies and couriers to come to him in secret and bring information from Jerusalem about what is happening. It is now that David learns for the first time that Ahitophel is among the conspirators. It must have been a terrible blow, both for the personal betrayal itself and for the added danger threatened by his support of Absalom. A little later, the narrator inserts this chilling information. I quote, "In those days, the advice which Ahitophel gave was accepted like an oracle received from God. That is how the advice of Ahitophel was valued, both by David and by Absalom." All that David can now do is pray to God. I quote, "Please, O Lord, frustrate Achitophel's counsel. End quote. And it seems that his prayer is answered immediately by the sudden appearance of the other key figure in the battle of wits for controlling the mind and actions of Absalom and saving David's throne. His name is Hushai, the Archite, and he is simply described as David's friend, though this appears to be a more formal title in the book of Chronicles. An elderly man, he comes to greet David with his robe torn and with earth on his head, symbols of mourning for what has happened. David must have a high opinion of Hushai's talents, or else he is simply grasping at straws. He says, "If you continue with me, you will only be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I am your servant, O king, as I was formerly a servant to your father, now I am your servant,' this way you can overturn for me the counsel of Achitophel." David tells Hushai that he can use the sons of the priests to bring back information. With David's contingency measures in place, his fight back begins, and the political struggle enters a new phase. As the Bible records, Hushai, the friend of David, came to the city, just as Absalom came to Jerusalem. We can leave David now, bowed down and weeping, starting on his second journey into exile at this late stage of his life. In Jerusalem, the verbal duel between Achitophel and Hushai is about to begin. Achitophel gives his first recorded piece of advice to Absalom. He speaks using the imperative form of the verb to come, which has a direct sexual connotation. I quote, Achitophel says, "Have intercourse with your father's concubines, whom he left to mind the palace. And when all Israel hears that you have made yourself despicable to your father, he will strengthen the hand of all who are with you." End of quote. The advice is brutally logical, practical, and effective. Symbolically, it means that Absalom has taken the place of the previous king. It is aimed at convincing the people of the reality and finality of Absalom's coup. But in this way, Achitophel also ensures that Absalom has no way back from what he has undertaken. The Bible simply records, I quote, "So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in public view of all Israel." End of quote. The real battle of wits is now about to begin, with a debate in Absalom's circle about how to remove any threat from King David. But first, Hushai has to gain Absalom's confidence, presumably having changed his torn clothes and removed the earth from his head. The biblical text suggests just how difficult this might be, with the opening words, designating Hushai as David's friend. David had given him a general approach. Now Hushai has to allay Absalom's obvious suspicions. Hushai begins, quote, "Yehi HaMelech, long live the king, long live the king." But Absalom is too much of a politician to be easily persuaded. Perhaps in the question he now asks, there is also a touch of concern about the fragility of personal relationships where political choices have to be made. He asks, "Is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend?" But Hushai replied to Absalom, "Not at all. With the one whom God and the people and all the men of Israel have chosen, lo ehyeh v'ito eshev. With him I will be, and with him I will remain." At this point, it is necessary to indicate a certain ambiguity in the Hebrew text. It might not be detected when Hushai's words are spoken, but it is there in the written record. The Hebrew word lo in the phrase lo ehyeh could have two spellings. It could be written as lamed aleph, meaning no, which would translate as I will not be. But it can also be written as Lamed Vav, meaning to him. The Hebrew text in this sentence is actually written here as not, as if Hushai has actually said to the one chosen by God, meaning Absalom, I will not be loyal. But the Masoretic tradition has preserved both forms and has instructed us to read it as to him I will be loyal. The distinction may ultimately be the result of some orthographic uncertainty, but it is hard not to see in the two options a hint, for the reader at least, at Hushai's personal dissembling. At this crucial moment, it seems that he is truly speaking untruth to power. Hushai continues his logical justification. Quotes, moreover, whom should I serve if not David's son? As I served your father, so will I be yours. We have to wait to find out whether Absalom is sufficiently convinced of Hushai's trustworthiness to accept him. But he probably enjoys being addressed as the king and endorsed by such an important figure. Now it is time for Achitophel to offer his simple but well thought through and practical plan. It is briefly told, I quote, let me choose 12,000 men, and I will rise up and pursue David this very night. I will come upon him while he is weary and militarily weak, and I will make him panic so that all the people with him flee, and I will kill the king alone. Then I will bring all the people back to you. When all the people have returned, except the man you are seeking, then all the people will be at peace. End of quote. Part of Achitophel's closing words are a bit confusing in the Hebrew text, but his plan is clear. Isolate David and kill him. Achitophel is inventing the surgical strike while making sure that there is no collateral damage. I quote, the advice was right in the eyes of Absalom and in the eyes of all the elders of Israel. End quote. And yet something seems to make Absalom uneasy, and he decides he wants a second opinion from Hushai. No reason is given in the biblical text for this decision. A religious reader may see here the hand of God intervening in response to David's prayer. But there may be more personal factors that influence Absalom, including his understandable caution when it comes to defeating David. Perhaps he asked Hushai's advice because Hushai was an intimate friend of David and would have a view on how he might react. On the other hand, it might even be that the consensus of the elders of Israel might have raised some questions with Absalom. Indeed, it is a different group of people, not the elders, who will eventually support Hushai's proposal. Absalom summons Hushai, tells him Achitophel's plan, and concludes, shall we follow his advice or not? You speak. End of quote. This is Hushai's opportunity, and he plays brilliantly on the mindset of his hearers. While Achitophel used hard, realistic military logic, Hushai works instead on another level. Perhaps he deserves to be credited with recognizing the nature of emotional intelligence and knowing how to manipulate it. He starts by painting a very different picture of Achitophel's weary and militarily weak David. Instead, he plays on popular legends about the heroic king, his loyal troops, and the military threat they pose. He begins, this time what Achitophel advised is not good. There must have been some kind of uproar at his remarks, because the author inserts a second then Hushai said, suggesting that he waited to start again till things had calmed down. Now he hits home with his first message addressed directly to Absalom. Ata yadata, you of all people know that your father and his men are courageous fighters, and they are in a bitter state like a bear in the wild robbed of her whelps. Moreover, your father is a skilled military man and would not spend the night with the troops. You can almost see him now, hiding in one of the pits or in some other place. And if any of your troops should fall at the first attack, whoever hears it will say, a disaster has struck the troops that follow Absalom. And even if such a person is a brave man with the heart of a lion, he will be shaken. For all Israel knows that your father and the soldiers with him are courageous fighters. End quote. He begins and ends with a powerful image of the legendary military power of David and his men. But in between, while acknowledging David's tactical skills, he does depict him negatively as skulking in some hole in the ground. So far, Hushai has undermined Achitophel's assured description of the ease with which David will be captured. The old warrior who hid from Saul all those years and was never captured, who earned his place as king because of his military successes, will not be a simple target. Isolating and killing David may possibly be successful, as Achitophel suggests, but that will leave a lot of his supporters alive who might become a serious danger to the new regime. It is also possible that Hushai is playing with an idea conceived and repeatedly expressed by David in the book of Samuel, that the one anointed by God to be king should not be killed, which is why David twice spared King Saul's life. Who knows how God might react to David's death? Achitophel may have cold logic on his side, but the God of Israel was not to be lightly offended. So far, Hushai has only been setting the scene. In what follows, he seems to be exploiting a potential weakness that he has perceived in Absalom. He proposes what on the face of it seems to be an equally logical strategy: to gather an overwhelming force to wipe out David and all his supporters together. I quote, "So I advise that all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sands of the sea, be summoned to join you, and that you yourself lead the way into the battle. When we come upon him in whatever place he may be, we will fall upon him like the dew falls upon the ground, and no one will survive, neither he nor any of the men with him. And if he withdraws into a city, all Israel will bring ropes to that city and drag its stones as far as the riverbed, until not even a pebble of it is left." End of quote. What is the reaction? Absalom said, and all the men of Israel, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Achitophel. Hushai's plan, of course, has been to delay the pursuit of David as long as possible, so that he has a chance to regroup, muster his forces, and plan his counterattack. But why has he succeeded in persuading Absalom? What Hushai seems to have exploited is Absalom's vanity, his vaunted beauty, his magnificent hair, his chariot, horses, and runners, his calculated popular appeal. Above all, how could Absalom allow Achitophel to have the glory of capturing and killing David? Military heroes are the ones who are remembered, who retain the respect and admiration of the population. There is no evidence in the Bible of Absalom, now about to become commander-in-chief of one of the great military forces in the region, ever having participated in a battle. So Absalom should be the one to ride at the front of the mighty army, drawn from every corner of the nation, and he should have the credit for defeating David. Indeed, he would be defeating his father in the arena where David's fame was established. What songs might be sung like the one repeated 3 times in the book of Samuel? Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. What might they sing now about King Absalom? There is another factor to consider here in the way the 2 different pieces of advice are received. In the case of Achitophel's plan, the Bible points out that it was considered as right in the eyes of Absalom and in the eyes of the elders of Israel. Presumably the elders, who represent the ancient leadership of the tribes, have endorsed it together with the king as a shared decision. But the response to Hushai's plan has a different audience and a way of responding. Absalom said, and all the men of Israel agreed to it. The elders, so to speak, have left the room, and it is Absalom who gives his opinion, and those who are present simply agree with him. Perhaps it was even the support of the elders for Ahithophel's plan, and his impatience at having to accept their wise counsel was one of the factors that made Absalom ask for his second opinion. What follows has a certain inevitability. Hushai reports his own advice and that of Ahithophel to the priests. Their two sons, despite nearly being caught by Absalom's men, bring the information to David. They also convey Hushai's warning that David should not remain where he is in case Ahithophel's plan is accepted, and Absalom's troops catch him. In a rapid night maneuver, David and all his men escape. They regroup. David appoints 3 commanders, including Joab, to the army that he amasses, and a short-lived civil war ensues, with David's men victorious. In a tragic conclusion to the story, we learn for the first time the degree to which David loved Absalom despite everything. And it may be that that affection blinded him to Absalom's plans. David gives orders to all the troops to capture Absalom alive and not to harm him. The battle lost, Absalom flees on a mule through the forest, and his head and hair are caught in the branches of a tree, while the mule moves on. As the Rabbi describes it, he was held there between heaven and earth. A soldier found him and reported to Joab, who asked why he did not kill Absalom. But the soldier insisted that David had given the order to spare Absalom, and he did not want to risk David's wrath. Joab, ever the pragmatist, where the monarchy is concerned, aware that a living Absalom could be a constant threat to David, stabs him, and 10 of his young men finish him off. They throw the body in a pit and fill it with a cairn of stones. An almost comic argument rages about who should bring the news to King David. When he finally receives the information, David breaks down completely, weeping and moaning aloud the words, I quote, "My son Absalom, oh my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, oh Absalom, my son, my son." Joab, with the fate of David's monarchy at stake, is furious at this display of weakness. He rebukes David for the way his behavior insults the sacrifices made by the soldiers who had displayed their loyalty to him. I quote Joab, "You are showing love to those who hate you and hatred to those who love you." David, he argued, risked losing more people by this attitude than he lost in the rebellion itself. Goaded by Joab, David put aside his personal anguish and fulfilled his duty as king. He sat in the gate, and when the troops heard he was there, they came and presented themselves before the king. There are 2 biblical sentences which offer a commentary on what has occurred. One comes from the author, or possibly a later editor, placing David's successful defeat of Ahithophel firmly in God's hands. I quote, "The Lord had decreed that Ahithophel's sound advice be overturned, so that the Lord might bring ruin upon Absalom." The second addresses the fate of Ahithophel. With the same uncompromising logic with which he devised his plans for Absalom, Ahithophel foresaw exactly what would happen if Hushai's plan was accepted. Absalom would lose, and David would inevitably take revenge on Ahithophel and his household. So he took the necessary steps to protect them. With great simplicity, and I would argue considerable respect, the Bible provides Ahithophel's epitaph. I quote, "When Ahithophel saw his advice had not been followed, he saddled his ass and went home to his native city. He gave instructions to his household. Then he hanged himself and died, and was buried in his ancestral grave. This is a somewhat grim note on which to end. As I was writing this talk, I could not help but think of contemporary events and characters that might echo what is recorded in the book of Samuel. I was even tempted to add a disclaimer, quotes, any resemblance to actual persons living or dead or actual events is purely coincidental. And yet the purpose of preserving the book of Samuel in the Hebrew Bible is precisely the opposite of such a disclaimer. In Christian Bibles, the book of Samuel is classified together with books like Ruth, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, indicating that they are viewed as historical accounts, with whatever attitude towards history this categorization might imply. In the Hebrew Bible, however, Samuel belongs with Judges and Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Jonah, and others, which fall under the rubric of Nevi'im, prophets. That is not to suggest that they foretell the future, but rather that they attempt to present a divine perspective on the events that are described therein, and evaluate them as God might view them. Therefore, they provide both a time-bound and timeless perspective, available for us to use to help us measure and interpret what is happening in the world around us at any given time. In the Hebrew Bible, no aspect of human activity is excluded from consideration. The book of Samuel, whatever else it offers, focuses also on the political structures and behaviors that underpin the nature and quality of our life together in human communities. Absaloms, anywhere, will be driven by their insatiable need for acceptance and recognition, will nurse their envy and yearn for power to prove to themselves their worth. Amnons will believe that their privileged position makes them immune to judgment and punishment. Tamars will be vulnerable to sexual and other forms of abuse wherever society looks the other way. Achitophels will offer their intellectual skills to the highest bidder, whether the goal is for human benefit or destruction. Joabs will support and protect the institutions of power with violence, whether justified or not. Hushais, out of loyalty and faithfulness, will risk their lives and reputations to protect a friend in need. And Davids will try to live out a personal call to carry the burdens of society at the highest level while struggling with their own inner demons and with the temptations that come with power. These stories in the Hebrew Bible are there to entertain, to instruct, and to warn us if we wish to learn. As the rabbis have taught, hafochba, hafochba, decholaba. Turn it and turn it again, for everything is in it. Thank you.
マゴネット先生、ありがとうございました。
どういたしまして。
それでは、ただいまから質疑応答の部に移りたいと思います。質疑応答の部は、須藤一郎教授とヒラルド・ロドリゲス准教授の通訳付きです。海外との通信で時間も限られているため、挨拶や持論は省略して、講演の内容についての質問を簡潔にお願いしますとアナウンスするはずだったんですけれど、この人数とこの残り時間なら言わなくていいかもしれませんね。はい。そして、もう限られた人数ですので、手を挙げるだけでも見えるかもしれませんが、一応手を挙げるボタンを活用していただきたいと思います。Zoom の画面下のバーに参加者の絵をクリックすると、右側に参加者リストが表示されます。その右下隅に、点々点というボタンがあるので、押して手を挙げるを選択してください。そうしますと、 ポスト側のリストにお名前が挙手マークとともに最上段に来るので、質問者と識別されます。順番に指名しますので、指名されましたらミュートを解除して質問を始めてください。質問が終わったら同様の手順で手を下ろすボタンを押してください。挙手マークを消すことができます。それでは質問のあります方は手を挙げるボタンでお示しください。はい。原田光さんから質問が出ております。原田さんの質問は、ロドリゲス先生がマゴネット先生に通訳をいたします。原田さん、どうぞ。
講演ありがとうございました。最後の終盤のところで、このサムエル記の分類ですね、についてお話がありまして、そこはとても私にとっては興味深いところでございました。そのいわゆる歴史的記述とまた預言者たちのユダヤ教におけるその2つのなんていうんですかね、分類の違いについて、それが語ろうとしているものの違いについて、もう少し詳しく教えていただければと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you for your lecture. I would like to ask you about it was very interesting to know about the difference in the classification of the book of Samuel between Christianity and Judaism, this classification of historical books and prophetic books. So if you don't mind, I would like to know more about this classification and the meaning, what it means, this difference of classification.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for the question. 誰か翻訳、集約します。
翻訳は須藤先生がいたします。
はい、まずご質問ありがとうございました。
こんばんは。Hello.
はい。
It's more or less as I suggested in my last words.
最後にちょっと示唆をしたんですけれども、これはもっとたくさんのことが含まれています。
It is quite clear that the Christian Bible, in arranging the order of the books in the Hebrew Bible, arranges them in a historical sequence.
キリスト教の聖書がこのヘブライ語の聖書を歴史的な順番に並べているということは明らかです。
So after Deuteronomy, we start with Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth, because the beginning of the book of Ruth says at the time when the judges judged. So it's a historical organization.
で、新明記の次にヨシュア記が来て、そしてキリスト教の聖書ではルツ記が来るんですけども、どうしてかというと、ルツ記の冒頭で、この士師たちの時代にってあるからですね。で、それでつながってるわけです。
But I don't know what that historical sequence, the significance of that historical sequence for Christians reading the Hebrew Bible.
このキリスト者たちがヘブライ語の聖書を歴史的な順序で読んでいるということの意味については、ちょっと私にはよく分かりません。
History might be interesting, but I'm not quite sure what message it brings in terms of the actual books themselves.
で、歴史というのは確かに興味深いんですけれども、しかしこの聖書を読んでいくときにそれがどういう意味をもたらすのか、ちょっとはっきりしません。
But the Hebrew Bible order goes from after Deuteronomy goes Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, but it classifies them as the early prophets, and therefore they have the same authority and message as the great prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc.
ヘブライ語の聖書では、新明記の次にヨシュア記、そして士師記でサムエル記、列王記というふうに並んでるんですけども、これらが、前の預言者たちというふうに分類されています。で、預言者たちという呼ばれ方してますので、イザヤ、エレミヤ、他のその大預言者たちと同じ権威とメッセージがあるというふうに見なされているわけです。
So therefore those early historical books have to be treated with the same seriousness as we would treat the other major prophetic figures.
ですので、括弧付きですけれども、その歴史的なその物語、そこで語られていることっていうのが、時代的には後に語られてきているこの大預言者たちのメッセージと同じ重みとして捉えられているってことです。
There may be a slightly different way of also viewing these texts.
おそらくまたテキストをどういうふうに眺めるのかという点でも違いがあるだろうと思います。
In traditional Jewish thought, the 5 books of Moses are the direct word of God dictated, so to speak, to Moses. They are the direct expression of God's words.
そのユダヤ教の伝統的な捉え方では、モーセ五書というのはこれは神の直接的な言葉であって、神がモーセにこれを直接語って聞かせたものというふうに考えています。
But the prophetic books from Judges through to the end of to Malachi there is a rabbinic saying about these prophetic books: no two prophets prophesy in the same style. That is to say, the words of the prophets are divine words mediated through a human consciousness.
はい。で、この預言者たちですね、ヘブライ語の聖書で預言者たちと、呼ばれているのが、新明記からマラキ書までなんですけれども、でラビの有名な言い方で、どの2人の預言者もこの同じ語り方はしていないっていうものがあるんですね。ということはつまりこの預言者たちというのは人間の言葉でもって神の言葉を媒介している、仲介して伝えているという捉え方なんです。
And the third division of the Hebrew Bible, the Ketuvim, are understood to be inspired in human beings by the Holy Spirit, by the Ruach HaKodesh. They're inspired human writings.
第3の分類、トーラーがあってですね、5章があって、それからネビーム、預言者たちがあって、3番目、ケトゥビーム、書書なんですけれども、でここはこの聖霊によってこのインスパイアされたと、御霊を注がれて、この、人間にそれが与えられて書かれているもの という位置づけになっています。
So across the three divisions, there is a move from the complete, as it were, divine word to a divine word modified by human experience to a human creation inspired by God. They have less degrees of sanctity, so to speak, as you pass through the three categories.
で、この3つの部分ですね、3つのカテゴリーで、それぞれにこの神の言葉の位置づけが少しずつ変わってるわけですよね。で、最初のところは、これは神の言葉そのものです。で、2番目、預言者たちですけども、これは神の言葉がこの人間たちによって媒介されて、少し形を変えられていると。で、そして3番目、諸書のところは、この聖霊に促されて、人間が創造している言葉だと。そういう位置づけになります。
Thank you. Expressed another way, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is God's self-revelation to human beings. The Ketuvim are human beings' self-revelation to God.
で、別の言葉で言えば、このトーラーは神の自己啓示であると。神がご自身を啓示してくださっているもの。それからケトゥビーム、諸書のところは人間が自らを開いて示していると。人間の自己啓示であるということができると思います。
So this, I'm just suggesting that all three categories, though, carry a particular weight of revelatory material, which has to be taken seriously in terms of where they belong in the Bible.
この3つのカテゴリー、それぞれがですね、その啓示的な素材を示しているわけです。で、それぞれの仕方で提示をしていると言えます。
But I'm not sure where the category of history works within the Christian way of reading the Hebrew Bible. My fear is it means something like this is what happened in the past, but is not necessarily particularly relevant anymore. But I may be wrong. I would require a Christian theologian to answer that.
私はその歴史という見方についてはちょっと心配していることもあります。で、それはですね、ちょっと読み方を間違えるとこれは歴史だと、過去に起こったことであって、現在には直接は関係ないんだっていうふうに下手をすると思ってしまうんではないでしょうか。この点でキリスト者の神学者たちが歴史ってことをどう考えていらっしゃるのか、ちょっと伺ってみたいなと思います。
Perhaps, and this is a strange idea, but perhaps with the appearance of Jesus and the beginning of Christianity, history before Jesus is effectively dead because there is now a new beginning. Maybe that has something to do with the categorization, but I will stop making any proposals about this.
ですね、ひょっとすると、このイエスが登場したことによってですね、キリスト教はそこから始まってるわけですけれども、イエス以前のことは歴史ということになってしまって、これはもう死んだものになってしまってるのかなという、そんなことを考えますね。でもちょっともうこれ以上立ち入って語ることは控えたいと思います。
ありがとう。
Thank you.
ありがとうございました。
はい、あと30分ほどございます。
小林先生が手を
はい、
挙げられてます。
そうそう。
小林先生どうぞ。
ちょっと手の上げ方がまだわからなくてですね、実際にこうやって上げます。マゴネ先生、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
ありがとう。ロドリーゲ先生、ありがとうございます。今の旧約聖書の3区分の話ですよね。それで、キリスト教の場合は、確かに歴史的に並べられているっていうのは確かだと思いますけれども、それはイエスを頂点とする救済史があるからだと思います。救済史っていうサルベーションヒストリーをね、考えているからだと思います。
Thank you very much. About these three divisions in the Hebrew Bible. Yes, it is in Christianity, it is viewed in historical perspective. And I think it is because Jesus is at the center of this salvation history.
はい。確かに、歴史というふうに見てますけれども、しかしそこには、歴史を通して神が働くという、そういう信仰を、キリスト教徒も持っていると思います。ただ単に過去の歴史っていうふうにして、もう意味ないっていうんじゃなくて、聖書の神は歴史を、導く方、歴史を通して啓示し働かれる方っていうふうに、信じていると思います。
And we Christians also believe that through history, God is working. God has worked through history. History is not only past things.
Should I respond and just to say, well, thank you for that clarification.
Okay.
こう明確にしてくださってありがとうございます。
はい、小林先生のはご回答でした。次の方、金丸先生、どうぞ。
はい。まず手を下ろしますね。手を下ろす。はい。マグネス先生、どうもありがとうございました。で私の質問、はい。私の質問も、小林先生がおっしゃったことと似ているんですけども、ということは、マゴネット先生の、考えでいくと、その歴史に対する見方というか、歴史に対するこう概念がキリスト教の、人たちと、それからユダヤ教の人たちが違うので、そういうふうなやっぱり違いが出てきているのではないかっていう、そういうふうに理解をし直していいですか
？My question is was similar to Kobayashi Sensei. So what you mean is that perhaps the concept of history or perspective on history is different in Judaism and Christianity.
That is a kind of generalization that would require much more thought.
I beg your pardon?
Oh, that generalization would require much more discussion and thinking.
まあ、そのような一般化というのはですね、もっと多くの議論が必要となってくると思います。
I was trying to limit myself to the way in which the Hebrew Bible is constructed and what it implies through that kind of construction. So that priority is given to the prophetic texts, which we okay, beyond history.
いや、で、まあ、私はここではですね、そのヘブライ語聖書がどのように形作られているのか、その構成がどうなっているのかと。で、まあ、そのことに限定してお話ししたいと思います。で、まあ、その預言者たちにどのような権威が与えられているのかということです。まあ、歴史との関連でですね。はい。
If you look at the festival tradition in Judaism, we anchor ourselves in the memory of particular historical events, which, as it were, repeat themselves annually. The Passover, the Exodus from Egypt as a liberation which God brought for us, the revelation at Sinai, these are historical moments which we repeatedly reevaluate as we go through the cycle of the year.
ユダヤ教ではですね、その1年を通してこう決まったお祭りをしているわけですね。で、それぞれのお祭りがこの歴史的な出来事を想起して、記憶するために行っているわけです。で、まあ、杉越の祭りもそうですし、カリオの祭りもそうですよね。で、その市内の山で神が啓示を与えてくださった、それを思い起こしながら、記念してお祭りを毎年毎年やってるということです。
And that can also be a weakness in our existence because we immediately translate what is happening to us as a minority in exile in terms of past such events. And therefore we have a kind of we make assumptions about what is happening to us, which may not be even correct. We are too much influenced by this is what they did in the past and so on. So history is a living but problematic part of our liturgical existence as Jews.
このようなやり方っていうのは弱点もあります。で、ユダヤ教というのはですね、まあ、補修の時から始まっているわけですけども、補修の時にその何が起こったのかということを解釈して解説しないといけない。昔に起こったことなんですけど、それはこういう意味でしたって、今にとってこういう意味がありますというのをいつも解釈しないといけない。で、それはいつも典礼を行っていくときですね、リタジーを行っていくときに、その解釈が過剰になる、そういう問題性もはらんでいるわけです。
So I think that's perhaps all I can say about this, about the impact of history or the thought of history in our Jewish consciousness. That's to say, it gives us sometimes models to understand what is happening, but those models may blind us to what is really happening. We get caught in a particular previous idea, and it's not open to a contemporary reality which may be slightly different. So history is dangerous, but nevertheless part of our self-consciousness as Jewish people.
で、この歴史がインパクトを与えるわけですけれども、で、そして私たちにそのモデルを与えてくれてるわけですけれども、でしかし下手をするとですね、 何が起こっているのかということを私たちの目を覆って、見えなくしてしまう危険もあります。でその昔に起こったことって、そこに注目して、でその意味があってこうしてると、今目の前で起こっているその現在の事柄っていうのが、下手をすると見えなくなってしまうと、ちゃんと見えなくなる危険があるってことです。
Okay. I hope that's an answer.
これ
いいですか。はい。いいですか。今のマゴネ先生の説明の中で、出エジプトの解放の話、杉越の祭りと一緒に出てきましたので、一言付け加えると、先ほど私は聖書の歴史からもう我々は学び、啓示を受けているということを言いましたけれども、出エジプトの、物語から、キリスト教はイエス・キリストにある救いって言って精神的、心の救い、魂の救いというふうに、受け取ってしまいがちなんですけれども、出エジプトから神の救いというものが経済的、社会的、自由からの解放、自由ですね。経済的、社会的、政治的な解放もそういう側面があるんだということを、学んでいるんですよね。でそういったことでやはり旧約聖書のその歴史からキリスト教徒も大きな刺激、学びを受けてますということを言いたいと思います。
So, since we are talking now, since Professor Magonet is talking now about the Exodus and the Passover, I would like to add that we Christians, as we study the history of the Bible, we can learn from the Exodus. We've seen in the Exodus, we've seen the work of Christ as the salvation of the soul, this spiritual salvation. But we also are learning that in the Exodus story, it is also about economic freedom or economic liberation, and also about social liberation. So it's about liberation too. We also try to learn about the history of the Hebrew Bible, the Exodus, as Christians.
Right. Okay.
Thank you. That is very helpful. Thank you. Translation?
すみません。
先生、手が上がっております。
ミュートしてました。すみません。ありがとうございます。とても助けになります。はい。
ありがとう。
はい、金丸先生、どうぞ。ミュートです。
マゴネット先生、どうもありがとうございました。2つのことを申し上げた私はもうやめるのですけれども、私は先生が提示してくださったことをジェネラルで一般化しようっていう思いはなくて、ただ私は例えばキリスト教学の1年生の学生にですね、やっぱり旧約聖書と新約聖書のことを教えて、そしてその歴史のどうして旧約と新約があるかっていうことを毎年教えていますので、そして私はヒストリアンですので、それをどういうふうに説明をしたらいいもんかっていうのがあったので、さっき質問いたしました。もう一つはですね、マゴネット先生が歴史に対する 危険性ですよね。そう言ってくださったのは大変ありがたいことで、私はマグノット先生が心配するような歴史家にならないように気をつけて頑張りたいと思います。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. I just would like to say two things about this topic. You said that we should avoid this kind of generalization, but I'm teaching Christian studies to freshmen and here in the university, and as I introduce the Hebrew Bible, I also introduce the historical books, and so I have to teach them about the meaning of the historical books. And that's why I was interested in this. And second, you mentioned that there is the risk of interpreting history in contemporary terms, but I think we should pay attention to this and be careful with the risks of interpreting history in contemporary terms.
Thank you very much. I was just thinking, looking back on my lecture, just how rich and complex the book of Samuel is, how human it is in its depiction of real human experiences. And one is always tempted to reduce them to, this means this is evidence why you should not sleep with with another soldier's wife. There is always a tendency to reduce the complexity of the narratives in the Bible to this means ABC. This is the moral lesson that we should learn. But the complexity of it must always force us to say that you cannot reduce it in this way. What is important is being engaged with the actual text itself, which may lead to many, many possible ideas and dimensions. And the sad thing is, if we don't dedicate the time to that level of reading, we have a very foreshortened kind of understanding of what it's about. So that's just my particular, my commercial for a close reading of biblical texts, because I think it gives you other levels of dimension than you expect when you just have a summary of this is what the story tells you, end of the story.
すみません、そのリスポンスですけども、金山先生ごめんなさい。ロドリゲス先生、もう一回私が言ったことを言ってください。歴史の見方を歴史については危険なことがあるので用心しなくちゃいけないと、全くその通り。そして言ってください。私は先生が言ったような歴史家にならないようにしようと思いまして、それをお伝えください。お願いします。
ちょっと待ってください。まず今、マグネス先生答えられたのを日本語にしますので、金村先生全部英語で分かってるから、スーッと先行っちゃうんですけど、はい。ですね、ここで今日の講演の内容のことをちょっと振り返って考えるんですね。で、このサムエル記が、非常に豊かな内容、そしてその人間的な事柄が事細かに書かれているわけですよね。で、真実な人間の経験がここでつぶさに描かれていると思います。ですけど私たちはこの聖書を読んでいくときにいつも誘惑にさらされると思います。このテキストの意味はこれこれこれこれこうですと。ここから得られる教訓は A、B、C。この道徳的な倫理的な教訓を意味として受け取りましょうというふうにですね。 テキストの持っている非常に豊かなこの広がり内容を歪小化してしまうという危険がいつもあると思います。ですから、このテキストですね、本文そのものと取り組んでいく、じっくりと読んでいくということが必要になると思います。で、ここから先は私の宣伝みたいになるんですけれども、どうぞ皆さん聖書の本文そのものをですね、もう密着してへばりつくようにして読んでください。時間とエネルギーを捧げてですね、そうすると本当に豊かな内容が響いてきます。はい。なるほど。はい。じゃあ私がやります。Professor Kanamal wanted to say, she is aware of the risks about the historicizing. So what she asked about the history is because she is engaged in the teaching of the newcomers in the class of Introduction into Christianity. And as a historian, she is confronted always with the question how we should read the Old and New Testament as history. 金丸先生、大体以上で間違ってますかね。英語でご自身でおっしゃってください。
Yeah. What I wanted to say is exactly what Kudo Sensei told you right at this point. And then also I want to add the very important things that I am very careful. I will be very careful not to be an ugly historian as you warned. This is what I want. Thank you very much.
はい。それでは、片山先生、お願いします。
Magonet先生、久しぶりでございます。片山です。はい。今日は本当に手に汗を握るような面白い、なんかこう、普通で聞けないような物語を語っていただいたというふうに思っております。ちょうど叙事詩を聞くようなエピックをですね、聞いているような、興奮を覚えながら聞きました。というのは、中に出てくる人物がですね、アヒトフェルとか、バトシェバとか、タマールとか、ヨハーブとかですね、そういった一人一人が本当に生き生きとこの聖書の中では語られている。しかも近代の小説と違うところは、それぞれの真理などは一切語らずにですね、これだけ本当にいろんなことを想像させるようなテキストは他にないんだろうというふうに思って非常に興奮をいたしました。この辺でちょっと後の質問が2つありますけれども、ちょっともうこの辺で通訳を捨ててください。はい。途中までで。
はい。はいはいはい。その次は私がやります。じゃあ。はい。
So, Magonet sensei, Professor Magonet, thank you very much. It's a long time no see. In today's talk, I felt it was a great talk and great study. It was a study of the epic gender, and in this epic form, we see the characters in the story vividly depicted in the Bible. We see all these characters like Absalom and Tamar and David and Job and so on. They are vividly depicted in the Bible. So far, my part.
So the biblical narrative, as you set forth, is telling almost nothing about the internal psychological things, what the characters think or feels. Only the external facts, and that is very, very exciting, very vivid narrative. Yes.
続きを質問をいたします。Two questions。一つはですね、このような聖書のいろんなことを語って、どんどん想像力をかきたてるような物語に影響されて、多くの文学者がこの箇所について書いてきたと思うんですね。例えばトーマス・マンとかですね。そういう人たちがこのまた物語からヒントをもらって、もっと詳しい近代的な小説を書いておりますけれども、そういった事柄、小説家がこれを翻案して、物語を書くということは許されるんだろうかと、そういう事柄について先生はどういうふうに考えていらっしゃるだろうかということが一つ、第一の質問です。もう一つはですね、浜野先生が最初におっしゃられたことと関係してるんですけれども、現代におけるさまざまな政治的な事件ですね、そういった中に私たちはこの、サムエル記の登場人物とあの人は同じだと、あの人はヨアブだなとかですね、あの人はアヒトフェルだなとか、そういうことを言うことは許されるんだろうかということが2つ目の質問です。
So I have two questions. One is, we see this story, different things being treated here, different characters appear in the story. And actually, these kind of stories in the Bible have been influential in the literary work of many authors, like Thomas Mann and so on. Is it allowed? They have been inspired by these biblical stories, and they have introduced this kind of themes in their work. Is this allowed? And the second question is, I see here that you are applying these characters, I mean the biblical story characters, to contemporary issues like the Jobs and the Davids and so on. Is this allowed?
Oh, what a great question.
素晴らしい質問ですね。
who is to say that it's allowed or not?
誰がそれが許されてるとか許されてないとか言うんでしょうか。
Um,
いや
um, the whole of rabbinic history is about the legitimacy of interpreting these texts.
I beg your pardon?
Yes, in our rabbinic tradition, we spend so much of our time interpreting these texts. They're there to be interpreted.
で、そのラビたちというのはですね、ものすごい時間と労力をかけて、このテキストを解釈ということを繰り返してきているわけです。で、その正当性ということの問題になってきます。
I think what is actually quite sad is that from the beginning of the Enlightenment and the beginnings of historical critical scholarship, we stopped taking the text seriously to be interpreted and instead told the text what it should have been instead, or what it might have historically been derived from. We stopped looking for the ideas that it contained and reduced it to some sort of assumed prior historical background on which it was constructed. It stopped being alive. It became, biblical scholars became pathologists of a dead text and not engaged with a real text. And luckily we had the novelists who reminded us that it is still a story which has to be read and amplified as a story.
Oh, こういう問いはですね、ちょっと不幸なところがあると思っているんです。というのはですね、啓蒙主義時代とともに、歴史的批判的な聖書解釈っていうのが、誕生してきたわけですけれども、残念ながらそれとともにですね、学者たちっていうのは、本当にそこに言われているお話は何なのかというのを見ることをやめてしまったってことなんですよね。でそうではなくて何を始めたかというと、いやこれは歴史的にはこうであるべきなのだと。でこの意味はこうでないといけないっていうね、何か先立つ前理解があってですね、でそれを、テキストに読み込んで、読んでしまうと、テキストそのものをありのままに受け止めるってことをライブで生きたものとして受け止めるってことをしなくなってしまった。でそれに対してこの小説家たちっていうのはですね、それじゃいけないんだよってことを思い起こしてくれる。物語をアンプリファイっておっしゃいましたけど、より豊かにしてくれてるんじゃないかと思います。
Yes, just to add to that, if you ever look at a page of what is called a rabbinic Bible, you will find on the same double page 4 verses of the Hebrew text, the Aramaic or several Aramaic translations, the commentary of Rashi in the 11th century in France, the commentary of Ibn Ezra in the 12th century in Spain, the commentary of Sforno in 17th century in Italy, all on the same page, arguing with each other about what the text means. And that is the joy of Jewish tradition, is that you can join them in the debate and always back to the tradition, and you argue, and you become the act of interpreting and sharing interpretations and disagreeing is is a highway to is a highway to God in Jewish tradition. Study like that is more important in some ways than even prayer as a way of approaching the divine through the interpretation of divinely inspired texts. It's a different kind of way of, and even a contemporary secular approach is only just another variation on the same basic desire to understand what it means. We just bring new ideas and tools to the same tradition. And it's fun. It is, it's a strange category in an academic theological discussion, but it is also fun and life enhancing and exciting and communicative with others. So it's not a sterile academic, limited academic sort of thing. It is a living tradition which you enhance by joining it and continuing it.
ですね、ラビニックバイブルとラビの聖書というページをぜひご覧になってください。そうするとそこにはですね、4節、ヘブライ語聖書の言葉がテキストが書かれていて、でそして、それのアラム語訳が並んでいて、でそれからこの、偉大なラビたちですね、ラシだとかイブン・エズラだとか、そういうラビたちの解釈が並んでいます。でそしてそれが全体が全部同じページに載ってるわけですよね。ということはここでそのヘブライ語の聖書テキストから始まって、時代はずっと異なるんですけれども、みんなが一緒になって議論をしているということなんですね。みんなが一緒になって、同じテキストを解釈している。でそこに私たちも加わっていくということで、この解釈の伝統ってこういう聖書を読んで探求していく、研究していくっていうことが、実は神に通じるこのハイウェイっておっしゃいました、一番の近道ということだと思います。でそしてちょっと奇妙に響くかもしれませんけども、こういう聖書の学びっていうのが実は場合によってはその祈りよりも重要というふうに、ラビのユダヤ教では考えられてきたということなんですよね。でそして、同じようなことが実は世俗的なアプローチでもなされるわけです。さっき小説家たちの、ことがあったんですけれども、でこのテキストの意味は何だろう、それをぜひ知りたいって言って探求をしていく。でこれが楽しいんですね。でちょっとアカデミックな世界、神学的な世界でね、面白い楽しいっていうのはなんか変な感じもしちゃうんですけれども、でもそうじゃなくてやっぱりここでコミュニケーションが起こるわけですよね。でなんというか消毒された無菌状態の何も生きていないそのアカデミックな環境っていうんじゃなくてですね、もう生き生きとした生き物に満ちている、力に満ちている、そういう伝統の世界ですよね。そうやって聖書を読んでいくってことを、ユダヤ教のラビたちはしてきているということです。
ごめんなさい。Nothing against academic, but it has limits.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
はい、それでは時間を10分ほどオーバーしてしまいましたけれども、質疑応答の時間はここまでとしたいと思います。それでは、講演会を閉じるにあたってもう一度皆さんでジョナサン・マゴネット先生に盛大な拍手をお願いします。マゴネット先生、ありがとうございました。
And thank you to all those who did the difficult translations. That's also very important.
ありがとうございます。 それでは、名残惜しいのですけれども、終了時間となりましたので、本日の学研公開学術講演会はこれにて終了させていただきます。皆様本日はご来場ありがとうございました。マゴネット先生もありがとうございました。Zoom ミーティングを閉じさせていただきます。
ありがとう。また来年。
はい。
Next year in Fukuoka.
思います。
今ちょっといいですか？
どうぞ。
片山先生のために、マゴネ先生がね、これ映るのかな？
はいはい。
はい。
映ります？
はい、映ります。
見えます？これが、
もうちょっと上に。
紹介した。これくらい？
はいはい。
はい、そうです。はい。
これ日本語でもわかりました？いいですか？
はい、大体分かったと思います。
ありがとう。
はい。それでは、Zoom ミーティングを閉じさせていただきます。ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。どうも。
ありがとうございました。
はい。